The morning sun barely touched the windows of Windsor Castle when William received the call that would change everything. His phone buzzed at 5:47 a.m., displaying a number he recognized immediately, his father's private line. Charles's voice was steady, but William could hear the weight behind each word as he delivered news that no son ever wants to hear. Kate was already awake, sitting by the window with her morning tea, watching their children play in the garden below. She noticed the color drain from her husband's face as he listened to his father speak. Without saying a word, she knew. Wives of 20 years develop an instinct for such moments, and Kate's heart began to race before William even ended the call. The doctors had found something during the king's routine examination. What started as a precautionary check had revealed shadows on the scans that shouldn't be there. The medical team was professional and thorough in their explanation, but the message was clear. Time was now measured differently for the royal family. William set his phone down with trembling hands. Kate crossed the room and took his face in her palms, searching his eyes for answers. "How long?" she whispered. The question hung in the air like morning mist, heavy and uncertain. William's voice cracked as he repeated what the doctors had told Charles. Perhaps months, maybe a year if they were fortunate. Their children's laughter drifted through the window, innocent and carefree. George was teaching Charlotte how to kick a football while Louis chased after butterflies. In that moment, both William and Kate realized that their family's world was about to shift in ways their children couldn't yet understand. The weight of the crown had always been present in their lives, but it had felt distant, something for the future. Now that future was rushing toward them like a tide they couldn't stop. William would soon carry responsibilities that had shaped generations of his family. But first, he had to find the strength to carry this news. Kate reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that had comforted them through countless challenges. They had faced public scrutiny, personal struggles, and the pressures of royal life together. But this was different. This was about losing the man who had guided William from childhood, who had shown him what it meant to serve with dignity and purpose. The irony wasn't lost on them that Charles had finally found his voice as king, finally stepped fully into the role he had waited decades to fulfill, only to have time become his greatest enemy. William thought about all the conversations they still needed to have, all the wisdom his father still needed to share about leading a nation and a family under the world's watchful eye. As the morning progressed, staff members noticed the unusual quiet that settled over the castle. Meetings were quietly rearranged, appointments postponed, and a bubble of protection formed around the family as they processed this private earthquake that would soon reshape the monarchy. Kate found herself thinking about her own children, about how to explain that their grandfather, who had taught them about duty and service, was facing his own greatest challenge. She thought about the public who had watched Charles evolve from a young prince into a devoted king, who had no idea that everything was about to change. William stared out at the grounds where he had played as a child, where his own children now played. The continuity of generations, the passing of responsibility from father to son, had always been abstract concepts. Now they were urgent realities that demanded immediate attention and careful planning. The phone calls would start soon, the meetings with government officials, the conversations with Commonwealth leaders, the delicate balance of maintaining stability while preparing for transition. But for now, in these precious quiet hours before the storm, William and Kate simply held each other, drawing strength from a love that had already weathered so many storms and would need to be stronger than ever in the days ahead. 3 weeks had passed since the diagnosis, and the secret felt like a weight pressing down on the entire royal household. William watched his father during their private dinners, searching for signs of the illness that was quietly changing everything. Charles seemed determined to maintain his usual pace, attending engagements and fulfilling his duties as if nothing had changed. But William could see the subtle differences. The way his father paused longer between sentences, the careful way he moved, the occasional distant look in his eyes. Kate had become the family's emotional anchor during these uncertain weeks. She managed their children's schedules, coordinated with their schools, and somehow maintained the appearance of normalcy, while her own heart was breaking for her husband. She had grown genuinely close to Charles over the years, appreciating his dedication to environmental causes and his gentle guidance of their children. The thought of losing him felt like losing a second father. The medical team had presented options: treatments that might extend time, experimental procedures that offered hope, but no guarantees. Charles had listened to everything with the same careful attention he brought to matters of state, asking thoughtful questions and weighing each possibility against his responsibilities as king. The burden of the crown meant that even his personal medical decisions carried implications for the nation. William found himself studying his father's daily routines with new intensity. The way Charles reviewed documents, how he interacted with his staff, the gentle but firm way he handled difficult political situations. There was so much to learn and not enough time to absorb it all. The transition they had assumed would happen years in the future was now an urgent necessity. Kate noticed how the palace staff had begun to change their behavior around William. Subtle shifts in deference, the way conversations paused when he entered rooms, the manner in which his opinions were weighted more heavily in discussions. The machinery of monarchy was already beginning to adjust, preparing for a future no one wanted to face but everyone needed to accept. Their children sensed something was different, though they couldn't identify what. George asked more questions about his grandfather's health. Charlotte seemed more clingy during bedtimes, and Louis had developed a habit of asking when they would see Grandpa King again. Kate and William had agreed to wait before telling them the full truth, but they knew that conversation was approaching rapidly. The international community remained unaware of the king's condition, but maintaining that secrecy required careful choreography. Charles's public appearances were strategically scheduled to show strength and continuity, while his private calendar was quietly adjusted to conserve his energy for the most important duties. During one particularly difficult evening, William found himself in his father's study, surrounded by decades of accumulated wisdom about leadership and service. Charles was showing him specific protocols, explaining relationships with foreign leaders, sharing insights about the delicate balance between constitutional duty and personal conscience. These conversations felt both precious and heartbreaking, knowing they were racing against time. Kate often joined these sessions, bringing tea and staying to listen. Charles had always respected her practical wisdom and her ability to see beyond protocol to the human elements of royal life. He valued her perspective on how to maintain family connections while serving public duty, and he wanted her insights preserved for the challenges that lay ahead. The couple's private moments together became more intense and meaningful. They talked about fears they had never voiced, about the weight of responsibility that was shifting onto William's shoulders, about how to protect their children while preparing them for their own futures in service to the crown. Kate worried about William carrying this burden alone, while he worried about asking her to share a load she had never expected to bear so soon. As autumn deepened around Windsor, the reality of their situation became impossible to ignore. Charles was beginning to show visible signs of fatigue, though he worked hard to hide them from the public eye. The time for difficult decisions was approaching, and both William and Kate knew that their family's private grief would soon become a public journey that millions would witness and share. The decision to tell the children came on a gray November morning, when Louis asked why Grandpa King looked so tired during their last video call. William and Kate had rehearsed this conversation countless times, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of watching their children's faces change as understanding dawned. George, at 11, grasped the implications immediately. His shoulders seemed to grow heavier as he processed what his grandfather's illness meant for his own future. Charlotte, 9 years old, asked if the doctors were sure, if there wasn't some mistake. Louis, only 6, wanted to know if being sick meant Grandpa couldn't play football with him anymore. Each question broke their parents' hearts in different ways. Kate knelt down to Louis's level, choosing her words carefully. "Grandpa is very sick, sweetheart, but he still loves you very much. He might not be able to run around as much, but he still wants to spend time with you." William watched his wife navigate this impossible conversation with grace he couldn't have managed alone. The family spent that entire day together. No royal duties, no official obligations. They walked through the gardens at Windsor, played board games, and simply existed as a family facing an uncertain future. Charles joined them for dinner, and William noticed how his father seemed more relaxed around the children now that the secret was out, at least within their small circle. As winter approached, Charles began what he privately called his legacy conversations with William. These weren't just about royal protocol or constitutional duties, but about the deeper aspects of leadership that couldn't be found in any handbook. They talked about making difficult decisions when there was no clear right answer, about maintaining hope during national crises, about the loneliness that came with the crown and how to find strength despite it. Kate found herself documenting these conversations, not officially but in her private journal. She recorded Charles's stories about his own father, Prince Philip's advice, and the lessons learned from decades of public service. She sensed that these memories would become precious to William in the years ahead, and she wanted to preserve as many as possible. The medical updates grew more serious as December arrived. The treatments were helping, but the progression couldn't be stopped entirely. Charles and the doctors began discussing quality-of-life decisions, how long he could continue his royal duties, and when the public announcement would need to be made. William struggled with watching his father face these choices with such dignity. Charles had waited his entire life to be king, had finally found his rhythm in the role, and now had to contemplate stepping back while he still could. The decision to abdicate early, rather than continue until he was too ill to fulfill his duties, showed the kind of selfless leadership that had defined Charles's entire life. The conversations with government officials began quietly. The Prime Minister was briefed, as were the leaders of Commonwealth nations. Constitutional lawyers reviewed precedents and procedures. The machinery of succession, unused for over 70 years, began to turn slowly but inevitably. Kate watched William transform during these weeks. The man she had married, the father who coached their children's sports teams and worried about normal parental concerns, was evolving into someone who could carry the weight of a nation. It was beautiful and heartbreaking to witness, knowing that this growth came from such painful circumstances. Their private time together became even more precious. Late evening walks through the castle grounds, quiet conversations after the children were asleep, stolen moments of normalcy in the midst of extraordinary circumstances. Kate found herself memorizing these times, sensing that their life was about to change in ways they couldn't fully anticipate. The winter holidays took on special meaning that year. Charles insisted on maintaining family traditions, but everyone understood this might be their last Christmas together in quite this way. The children were more attentive to their grandfather, and he seemed to savor every story they told him, every laugh they shared, every moment of ordinary family joy. As the new year approached, William and Kate both knew that the time for private grief was ending. Soon their personal journey would become public, and they would need to guide not just their own family, but an entire nation through this transition. The crown that had seemed so distant was about to become their present reality, much sooner than anyone had expected or wanted. January brought the decision that everyone had been dreading but expecting. Charles called William into his study on a crisp morning, when the frost still covered the castle grounds. His father looked older than his years, but his voice was steady and resolute. "It's time, son," he said simply. The announcement would be made to the nation within the week. The next few days became a whirlwind of preparation that felt surreal to William and Kate. Constitutional experts explained procedures that hadn't been used in living memory. Speechwriters crafted words for moments no one wanted to face. Security teams planned for events they had only theorized about. The entire apparatus of the monarchy shifted into a mode that felt both ancient and impossibly modern. Kate found herself thinking about Diana during these intense days. She wondered what William's mother would have made of this situation, how she would have supported her son through this transition. Kate felt the weight of being the woman beside William as he prepared to take on the crown, knowing that millions would watch and judge her every move, every expression, every choice. The children were kept home from school, though they didn't fully understand why. The castle filled with officials and advisors, people who spoke in hushed tones and carried themselves with the gravity of historical moment. George began asking more serious questions about what would happen to their family, while Charlotte seemed to retreat into herself, processing the changes in her own quiet way. Charles spent his final days as king making personal calls to world leaders, explaining the situation and ensuring continuity of relationships. William listened to many of these conversations, learning diplomatic language he had never needed before, understanding the delicate balance of international relations that would soon become his responsibility. The hardest conversation came when Charles spoke privately with each grandchild. He explained that he would always be their grandfather, that being sick didn't change how much he loved them, but that their father was going to have very important new responsibilities. Kate watched through the window as Charles walked in the garden with each child individually, seeing her children grow up a little more with each conversation. William's final preparation sessions with his father lasted deep into the nights. They covered everything from state secrets to personal advice about handling the pressure of constant public attention. Charles shared stories about his own mother's wisdom, about learning to balance family life with duty, about finding moments of peace in the midst of overwhelming responsibility. The morning of the announcement, Kate woke before dawn and found William already dressed, standing at their bedroom window looking out at the grounds that would soon be his to oversee as king. She stood behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist, offering silent support for the day that would change everything. The television cameras were set up in the throne room. Charles had insisted on making the announcement himself, wanting to explain his decision directly to the people he had served. William and Kate would stand beside him, presenting a united front as the crown passed to the next generation. The children would remain private, protected from the immediate media storm that would follow. As they walked through the castle corridors toward the throne room, Kate noticed how differently the staff looked at William. The subtle shift in deference had become more pronounced, the recognition that they were witnessing history in the making. William's jaw was set with determination, but Kate could see the boy who had lost his mother too young, now preparing to lose his father in a different but equally devastating way. Charles took his place before the cameras with the dignity that had defined his reign. William and Kate stood to his left, their hands clasped together, their faces composed but revealing the emotion beneath. The words Charles had prepared were simple but profound, explaining his diagnosis, his decision to abdicate while he could still do so with dignity, and his complete confidence in William's readiness to serve. The world watched as a father handed his life's work to his son, as a king stepped down to let a new king rise, as a family faced their private grief in the most public way possible. Kate kept her eyes on William's profile, seeing the moment when the weight of the crown settled on his shoulders, even before any ceremony made it official. When Charles finished speaking, there was a moment of silence that seemed to stretch across the entire nation. Then William stepped forward, his voice steady but emotional, accepting the responsibility his father was passing to him. Kate moved with him, understanding that her own life had just changed irrevocably, that she was no longer just a princess but a queen in waiting. The world's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes of Charles's announcement, news channels across the globe interrupted their regular programming. Social media exploded with messages of support, concern, and speculation about what this unexpected transition would mean for the monarchy and the nation. William and Kate watched the coverage from a private room in the castle, holding hands as they witnessed their personal crisis become international news. The children were with them, trying to understand why their family was suddenly the center of such intense attention. Louis pointed at the television screen showing footage of their home and asked why so many people were talking about Daddy. The immediate aftermath felt like living inside a storm. The palace switchboard was overwhelmed with calls from government officials, foreign dignitaries, and media organizations seeking comment. Security was increased around all royal residences as crowds began gathering outside the gates, some bringing flowers, others simply standing in quiet support. Kate found herself thrust into a role she had been preparing for theoretically, but never expected to assume so suddenly. Royal protocol demanded that she appear composed and supportive, but privately she was terrified about the scrutiny that would now focus on every aspect of their family life. The children's privacy, which they had worked so hard to protect, would become even more precious and difficult to maintain. William's first official meetings as king designate were scheduled within hours of the announcement. Constitutional lawyers needed to clarify the timeline for formal coronation. Government ministers required briefings on continuity of leadership, and Commonwealth representatives sought assurance that relationships would remain stable during the transition. The medical team continued Charles's treatment, but he had made clear that his energy would now be focused on ensuring a smooth handover of responsibilities, rather than on aggressive medical intervention. This decision devastated William privately, even as he respected his father's choice to prioritize duty above personal considerations. International leaders began reaching out personally to William, offering support and expressing their readiness to work with him as the new monarch. These conversations, which would have felt overwhelming under normal circumstances, became another layer of responsibility he had to manage while processing his grief and concern for his father. Kate's parents arrived at the castle quietly, offering their support during this impossible time. Her mother helped with the children, while her father provided practical assistance with family matters. Having her parents close reminded Kate of the life she had chosen to leave behind when she married into the royal family, and how much more complex that choice was becoming. The public response was largely supportive, with people expressing admiration for Charles's dignity in making such a difficult decision and confidence in William's readiness to lead. However, there were also questions about the monarchy's stability, concerns about such a rapid transition, and speculation about Kate's readiness to become queen. William spent long hours with Charles during these first days, receiving intensive briefings on matters that had seemed distant and future-focused just weeks earlier. State secrets, diplomatic relationships, constitutional responsibilities, and the delicate balance of royal influence in a democratic society all became immediate concerns requiring his attention and understanding. The children struggled to understand why they couldn't go to school, why photographers were camped outside their home, and why their normally private family life had suddenly become public property. Kate tried to explain in age-appropriate terms while protecting them from the full intensity of the media attention. As the days passed, the reality of their new roles began to set in. William would soon be King William V, a title that carried the weight of centuries of history and the expectations of millions of people. Kate would become Queen Catherine, responsible for supporting her husband while carving out her own meaningful role in public service. The formal ceremonies were still weeks away, but the substance of the transition was happening immediately. William began attending Privy Council meetings, receiving daily briefings from government ministers, and making decisions that affected the nation. The learning curve was steep, but Charles remained available to guide him through the most complex situations. Kate found herself studying previous Queen's consort, trying to understand how to balance supporting William with maintaining her own identity and projects. She worried about losing touch with the causes she cared about, but also understood that her platform for making positive change was about to expand dramatically. Their private moments together became even more precious as public duties consumed increasing amounts of time. Late evening conversations in their private quarters, quiet breakfast times before the children woke up, and stolen moments during official events became their lifeline to the partnership that had sustained them through everything else. 3 months into their new reality, William and Kate had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and completely foreign. William was officially king now, having navigated his first major constitutional crisis and several international diplomatic challenges with a steadiness that surprised even himself. Kate had assumed her role as queen consort, supporting her husband while finding her own voice in causes she had championed for years. The children had adapted with the resilience that children often show, though the changes in their lives were significant. George had begun receiving additional tutoring about constitutional history and his future role, while Charlotte and Louis were learning to navigate increased security and public attention. They still attended their same school, but the journey there now involved careful coordination with protection officers. Charles's health had stabilized somewhat, allowing him more time with his grandchildren and the opportunity to see William successfully managing his new responsibilities. The former king had moved to a smaller residence on the Windsor estate, close enough to be available for advice but far enough to give William space to establish his own leadership style. The coronation was scheduled for late spring, and preparations were consuming enormous amounts of attention from palace staff and government officials. Kate found herself involved in details she had never considered, from the guest list that would represent the entire Commonwealth to the music that would accompany ceremonies steeped in centuries of tradition. William's confidence in his role was growing daily, but Kate could see the toll it was taking on him personally. The weight of constant decision-making, the knowledge that his choices affected millions of people, and the relentless public scrutiny were challenging even for someone who had been preparing for this role his entire life. Their relationship had deepened through this crisis, but it had also changed in ways they were still discovering. Private conversations often centered on matters of state rather than personal concerns. Their parenting decisions now carried implications for the future of the monarchy. Even their choice of vacation destinations required consultation with security and diplomatic advisors. Kate had established her own office within the palace structure, focusing on early childhood development and mental health initiatives that had always been close to her heart. The platform that came with being queen allowed her to bring unprecedented attention to these issues. But it also meant that every public statement was analyzed for political implications she had never intended. The international community had embraced William's leadership more quickly than anyone had expected. His environmental advocacy, his military background, and his modern approach to royal duties resonated with younger populations while reassuring traditional supporters of the monarchy. Kate's natural warmth and genuine interest in people made her an effective partner in diplomatic relationships. Their private family time had become more structured and therefore more precious. Sunday mornings were reserved for family activities without royal duties. Weekday evenings included homework help and bedtime stories when possible, and holiday traditions were maintained even when they required extensive security arrangements. The media attention had evolved from the initial crisis coverage to ongoing fascination with how this young family was modernizing an ancient institution. Every public appearance was scrutinized, every fashion choice analyzed, every interaction with their children examined for insights into their parenting philosophy and its implications for future royal generations. Charles's presence at family gatherings was a reminder of both how much had changed and how much remained constant. His grandchildren still sought his advice and enjoyed his stories, but they were also beginning to understand that their father now held the position their grandfather had occupied. The transition of authority within the family mirrored the larger constitutional changes taking place. Kate often found herself thinking about the woman she had been just months earlier, when her biggest concerns were school events and charitable commitments that felt manageable and personally meaningful. Now her schedule was planned months in advance. Her wardrobe choices carried diplomatic significance, and her casual comments could influence public opinion on major issues. The approaching coronation represented both a culmination of this extraordinary period in the beginning of what everyone understood would be decades of service ahead. William and Kate were preparing for a ceremony that would formally recognize what had already become their reality, marking the official end of their previous life and the beginning of their reign. As spring arrived at Windsor, bringing renewal to the gardens where their children played and hope for Charles's continued stability, both William and Kate felt ready for the ceremonial confirmation of roles they had already grown into through necessity, love, and an unwavering commitment to serving something larger than themselves. The morning of the coronation dawned clear and bright, as if the weather itself was cooperating with this historic moment. William woke early, as he had for months now, but this time the weight on his shoulders felt different. Not heavier, but somehow more settled, more accepted. Kate stirred beside him, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, both thinking about the journey that had brought them to this extraordinary day. Their children had been awake since dawn, excited by the unusual activity throughout the palace and the knowledge that this was a special day for their family. George understood the significance more than his siblings, but all three children were caught up in the pageantry and the sense that they were part of something important and historic. Charles arrived early to spend private time with William before the ceremonies began. Father and son stood together in the same study where they had shared so many difficult conversations over the past months, but now the mood was one of completion rather than preparation. Charles looked healthier than he had in weeks, as if this formal transition was giving him peace about the legacy he was passing on. Kate's preparation was a careful balance of tradition and personal expression. The gown had been designed to honor previous queen consorts while reflecting her own style and the modern monarchy she and William were creating. Her parents were there to help her dress, a reminder of the ordinary family moments that had shaped her long before she became a royal. The ceremony itself was a blend of ancient ritual and contemporary relevance that captured William and Kate's vision for their reign. Traditional elements that connected them to centuries of monarchs were balanced with innovations that reflected their values and their understanding of the modern commonwealth they would serve. When the moment came for William to take the oath, Kate could see the boy she had fallen in love with at university, transformed into the king he had become through necessity and choice. His voice was steady as he pledged to serve his people, but she could see in his eyes the memory of all they had endured to reach this moment. Kate's own moment of formal recognition as queen consort felt both surreal and inevitable. The crown that was placed on her head carried the weight of history, but also the promise of the future they would build together. She thought about their children watching from the congregation, seeing their parents accept responsibilities that would one day be part of their own inheritance. The congregation included representatives from around the world, all acknowledging this transition that had come about through circumstances no one would have chosen, but everyone could respect. The dignity with which Charles had handled his illness and abdication, and the grace with which William and Kate had accepted their accelerated responsibilities, had earned admiration across the political spectrum. After the formal ceremonies, the family gathered privately for a quiet meal that felt like a bridge between the public pageantry and their personal reality. Charles was visibly tired but genuinely happy, surrounded by his son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren as they began this new chapter of their family story. The evening brought reflection on how much had changed since that morning phone call that had started everything. William was now King William V, a title he wore with growing confidence and natural authority. Kate had become Queen Catherine, finding her own voice and role while supporting her husband and raising their children. Their love story, which had begun as a fairly normal university romance, had evolved into a partnership that would now serve an entire nation and commonwealth. The challenges that had tested them over the past months had strengthened rather than strained their relationship, proving that their bond could withstand even the most extraordinary pressures. As they stood together on the palace balcony, acknowledging the crowds who had gathered to celebrate this historic day, William and Kate both understood that their real work was just beginning. The coronation was an ending and a beginning, marking the close of one chapter and the opening of another that would define the rest of their lives. The world had watched them navigate crisis with dignity, accept responsibility with grace, and transform their private love into public service. Their farewell embrace with their old life and their welcome embrace of their new roles had indeed spoken louder than any words could have expressed. Looking out at the crowds, Kate squeezed William's hand in the same gesture of support and love that had sustained them through everything. They were no longer just William and Kate, university sweethearts who had built a beautiful family together. They were now king and queen, but more importantly, they were partners who had proven they could face anything together, serving something greater than themselves while never losing sight of what mattered most.